Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Now this is the fifth video on chapter 16, which will continue from 16.4.8 onwards, which has information on the menstrual cycle and the zygote and implantation and the development of the fetus, which we will study in this video. We start every study session with Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, and I advise you all to also start every study session with these words and beginning with the name of Allah, the most beneficent and most merciful. Now in this video we have covered up to 7 in the previous video, video 4. Now in this video we are going to be doing the menstrual cycle, which was in the previous syllabus as well, and then explain the role of FSH and luteinizing hormone, estrogen and progesterone in controlling the menstrual cycle. Then we have to discuss the early development of the zygote, limited to the formation of ball of cells, which is called the embryo, that becomes implanted in the lining of the uterus. So we're going to talk about that. Then we're going to study the functions of the amniotic sac and the amniotic fluid. Then we have to identify on diagram the placenta and umbilical cord and describe their functions in relation to the exchange of dissolved nutrients, gases and excretory products between the blood of the mother and the blood of the fetus. Structural details are not required. And then the last point, which is new in the syllabus, is that some viruses can pass across the placenta and affect the fetus. Now, coming to the basic diagram of the uterus and the vagina, and this, of course, is the cervix, which is the opening of the uterus into the vagina. Now, we're going to come into very basics. I want you to first understand the basic, and then we go into more details. Now, first of all, what you have to understand is that the sperms deposited here in the vagina during sexual intercourse have a very long journey to go. They've got to go up and then they've got to either one of the oviducts. They can go right or left. Now, the ovum is released from the ovary. I said ovum is released from the ovary. So, ovary is an organ, ovum is the one cell which is haploid. And then, of course, the sperms have had their long journey and they've reached here now. So it is the outer 1/3 of the oviduct where fertilization is going to take place. So this is the point here where fertilization is going to take place. So the sperms have traveled from here, they've traveled all this way up here and they've reached the ovum, and then here fertilization is going to take place in the outer 1/3 of the oviduct. Now once fertilization has taken place, now one cell, the zygote, has been formed. Now this one cell the zygote has now is diploid. So this one cell the zygote is diploid. Now this has to travel here and it has to get implanted here. So the word is implanted, and it says in your syllabus implanted in the lining of the uterus. Now this red is the lining of the uterus. This is the lining of the uterus, and technically it's called endometrium. You don't have to know that name. So I've given you a basic understanding of it, that what is going to happen is that the sperms are going to travel all this way up here and they're going to fuse here with the ovum, which is released from the ovary, and this is going to result in the formation of one cell, the zygote. One cell, the zygote, is formed. This zygote now is going to be carried here towards the uterus, and it is going to be carried by cilia, which are present in the oviduct, and by peristalsis. So there is a muscle in the wall of the oviduct. So two things are going to propel it, because it cannot move itself, doesn't have a tail. The sperms have a tail, which we discussed in the last video. So they can travel, but the ovum cannot travel. So the ovum has to be pushed by the cilia in the oviduct and by the peristalsis, by the muscles in the wall of the oviduct. So these two things are going to ensure that this moves here towards the uterus and then implants in the uterus lining. Now sometimes the rare event is sometimes the zygote that is formed, it implants here in the oviduct and starts to grow. Now that is called a tubal pregnancy. And that is a dire emergency. Why? What is going to happen? The woman has to be rushed to the hospital and this tube has to be removed. Well, she has this other tube, so she can get pregnant. There are many people who have had lost one oviduct in tubal pregnancy and then have had two or three or four children even with just one oviduct. So it's not a question that she can't have any more children anymore. She can, because one oviduct is gone, but the other oviduct is still present. So these are one of those rare things which I often talk about in class with you all as well, so that you all know that these are the abnormalities which can happen and you can have a suggest question on that in your exams. Now another diagram, which is of course a better diagram than mine, and what is you can see here, the first thing is ovulation, which is the release of the ovum from the surface of the ovary. And then you can see the sperms here coming, and so the day zero fertilization has taken place. As I said, outer one third. Now when fertilization has taken place, a zygote has been formed. And then now this cell divides into two, and we call it the first cleavage, second two cell stage, four cell stage, and eight cell stage. And by that time, by day 4, 8 cell compacted, and day 5, then it has started to sink into the lining of the uterus and it is going to implantation occurs. So by day 8 or day 9, the implantation has occurred, which is that it has sunk into the lining of the uterus. And some of the cells have separated out and they are going to form now the early placenta, which is going to allow the transfer of nutrients from the mother's blood to the fetal blood. So you have to understand that in the uterus there the mother's blood circulation. So the uterus has the mother's blood circulation, but the fetus will start having its own circulation and it has its own blood group. The mother's blood group can be something else, could be an A, and the fetus could be a B blood group or an O blood group. So the mother and the fetal blood should never mix. Number one, the mother's blood is at high pressure. Number two, it can be a different blood group. So what we have to understand is that all the nutrients which are coming in the mother's blood have to pass on to the fetus, onto the embryo first, and then it's called the fetus. So from the mother, oxygen has to come transfer to the fetus. Now this can only happen across the placenta. Now this is a very nice diagram showing you the early development of the placenta. And later on, as this whole thing develops, then we have a very important structure which is called the amnion. So the amnion is the sac which is going to surround the fetus, and it's enclosed in this sac, which of course is going to ensure that it is totally pathogen free. And inside you have the amniotic fluid. So this is the amniotic cavity or the amniotic fluid. So the amniotic fluid acts as a shock absorber and it cushions the baby. The baby is of course protected, the fetus, sorry, it's not called the baby. The fetus is protected by the uterine wall. And then, of course, you have the placenta here. You can see here, this is the placenta. This is the placenta. And it connects the fetus by the umbilical cord. So this is the umbilical cord which is going and is connecting to the fetus. So in the umbilical cord is an umbilical artery and an umbilical vein. So the umbilical cord has an umbilical artery and an umbilical vein. Now you can see this is 7 weeks of development and this is 4 months of development. So by 3 months, the entire human form has taken place, but now it's going to grow in size. So the amnion or the amniotic, amnion is the membrane outside. So this is the amnion. This is the amnion which is enclosing this. The amnion produces the amniotic fluid. This is the placenta. And the placenta is connected to the fetus by the umbilical cord, which I've just shown you in this. So what we need to understand is the amnion, the sac which surrounds it, the fluid in it is called the amniotic fluid, and then the placenta and the fetus are connected by the umbilical cord. Sometimes we need to do a process which is a procedure which is called amniocentesis, in which we need to take a little bit of the amniotic fluid and analyze it for the genetics. Sometimes we suspect there's a genetic defect in the fetus. So you can see how with an ultrasound transducer we've sort of localized and we're not We're trying not to damage the fetus. And then we take a syringe and a needle and we puncture the wall of the abdomen, then we puncture the wall of the uterus and we take out some fluid, and that is called amniocentesis. We need to ascertain certain genetic, because you see, the fetal cells will be in the amniotic fluid. The fetal cells will be in the amniotic fluid, so this will have some of the fetal cells. And then, of course, we look at the cells under the microscope, and we can then look at its DNA and we can find out if it's got any genetic defects. Now, another diagram for all the students who are unable to really understand. Now, this, of course, area is the placenta. And then you can see this connection with the cord, and the cord is going here and here and here, and is all going here and here. And then you can see this would be the amnion or the amniotic sac. And this is the cervix, this is the vagina, and this is the fetus. So how do we label all this? Everybody should be very clear on that. Another diagram showing the placenta, the umbilical cord, the uterus, the amniotic sac, the amniotic fluid, the cervix, and the vagina. Now, please remember, the artery will have a smaller lumen and the vein will have a larger lumen. So arteries will have a smaller lumen. Remember arteries. Arteries have the crinkled endothelium and the veins have large lumens. So please remember, it will be the same case. It's not just because it's an artery and it's carrying deoxygenated blood, so it's going to have a different structure. And I remember this question which came in your paper, and you all were confusing these things. So our artery will always look like an artery. Why is it called an artery? So umbilical artery carries deoxygenated blood. Now this deoxygenated blood is because the fetal cells are respiring and producing carbon dioxide, so that needs to go to the placenta. Because in the placenta, what is going to happen? We're going to have an exchange of stuff. The mother's oxygen is coming here, and the carbon dioxide is going to diffuse into the mother's blood, and then the mother's lungs is going to exhale out the carbon dioxide. So the umbilical vein, it carries oxygenated blood, and that would be from the placenta to the fetus. Why? Because at the placenta, the mother's blood has come, they don't come in contact, there's a barrier between them. The placenta acts as a barrier between the mother's blood and the fetal blood. So the oxygen from the mother's blood, the red blood cells of the mother are carrying oxyhemoglobin. So oxygen is going to diffuse across into the fetal circulation. And the red blood cells of the fetus have hemoglobin in them. So they're going to form oxyhemoglobin. So the umbilical vein is from the placenta to the fetus. So it is going to be from the placenta, because the placenta is where it's picked up the oxygen, because in the placenta, it's the mother's blood is on one side and the fetal blood is on one side. It's just like the Wagah border. You have India on one side and Pakistan on one side. And trade takes place and things from India come and sell it in Pakistan, and Pakistan stuff goes from Pakistan to India. So this is what we have to understand, is that this is now a part, the placenta is where the transfer occurs. Please do not say, some of you say placenta provides. No, the placenta cannot provide, nor can it produce. So the word provide and produce cannot be used for the placenta. The placenta allows the transfer of nutrients from the mother's blood to the fetal blood, allows the transfer of carbon dioxide from the fetal, because the fetal cells are respiring, producing carbon dioxide. So that carbon dioxide has to pass into the mother's blood. And then, of course, it is exhaled out by the mother's lungs. Now, the role of the placenta have many functions. Number one, nutrition, excretion, protection of the fetus from the mother's immune system and against the mother's blood pressure, secretion of hormones such as HCG and human placental hormones. Immunity provides the fetus with antibodies from the mother, provides immunity for several months after birth. Another very important few things new added: forms a barrier between the mother and the embryo, delivers nutrients and oxygen, removes waste from the embryonic blood, becomes an endocrine organ, produces hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and other hormones that maintain pregnancy. Now, as you look at a little more detail of the amniotic sac or the amnion, the bag of membranes containing the fetus and the amniotic fluid, its function is to protect the baby. Now, as you look at the amniotic fluid functions, is the nourishing and protecting liquid contained by the amnion. The amnion, the wall, the amnion sac, in fact, produces the amniotic fluid. And this serves a number of important functions in the normal development of the embryo and fetus. Cushions the fetus against physical trauma. The woman has to sit, walk, She has to drive a car. So when she's sitting, she's actually pressing on the fetus. So, I mean, this fluid cushions the fetus, allows for fetal growth free from restrictions, provides a thermally stable environment, allows for normal development of the respiratory and gastrointestinal tracts and musculoskeletal system, helps prevent infection, provides short-term source of fluid and nutrients to developing embryo. Then another one which describes it in another simpler form, the fetus floats in the amniotic fluid. It allows fetus to move freely, aiding development of the muscles and bones. Prevents adherence of the amnion to the embryo. Yeah, because otherwise the amniotic sac would actually closely adhere to the growing embryo and later on the fetus. Acts as a cushion to protect the embryo from injuries, acts as a barrier to infection, permits normal lung development, permits symmetrical external growth of the embryo, regulates fetal water and electrolyte balance, assists in regulation of fetal body temperature. So the amniotic fluid is a very essential component, and if the amniotic fluid decreases, I mean, we as doctors and gynecologists and obstetricians, we get very worried. Why is it decreasing? Because that could result in certain problems. Now, some of this might be a little too detailed for you, but you have to understand is some details are required for you to develop a basic understanding of what is happening inside the ovary. Now, what is happening inside the ovary? What is happening inside the ovary is that by meiosis an ovum has been formed. Now you can see here, this is the ovum which they have colored in purple. So this is the ovum here and it has the zona pellucida. So this is the ovum here. But surrounding it in blue is what? These are called follicle cells. This structure is called follicle cells and more follicle cells are added to it. And it becomes bigger and bigger. And this is called the Graafian follicle. So this Graafian follicle becomes bigger and bigger, and then a fluid-filled space is formed in the middle here. You can see this fluid-filled space. And then of course this fluid-filled space becomes larger and larger and larger, and it comes to lie on the surface of the ovary, and it forms a cyst. And it forms not a cyst, you cannot say it's better if I use the word, it forms a blister. Like when you burn yourself, a blister forms on your hand. You drop some hot water on your hand, so a blister forms. And this is actually the water exerting force. And then it bursts. And when it bursts, this ovum is released with some of the follicle cells, which is given the name corona radiata, which you can see here. Now, when this takes place, this is called ovulation. When the ovum plus the follicle cells, so this was the ovum, and these are the follicle cells. So the follicle cells plus the ovum is thrown out of the ovary and it enters the fallopian tube or the oviduct. And what remains behind? Now this structure which remains behind, this structure, because now this has come out of it. This structure has come out of it. Now what is the remains of the Graafian follicle? Now that is called the corpus luteum. And in some books, it used to be called the yellow body, but we don't call it the yellow body anymore. Now we call it the corpus luteum, which are remains of the Graafian follicle. So after ovulation, now you can see how the corpus luteum is first larger and then slowly it's going to start to degenerate and it becomes smaller and then it's going to die. But if pregnancy occurs, then of course it remains because it keeps on producing the corpus luteum keeps on producing a hormone called progesterone. But the follicle cells produce the hormone estrogen. So that is why we tell you the ovary produces estrogen and progesterone. So because all this structure is inside the ovary that we are talking about. I talked about this in the beginning. I said this is what I'm going to say, what is going to happen here in the ovary. And this is called oogenesis. You don't have to know the name, but I mean, some of the students like to know a little more detail. So I like to give a little more detail. So this is called oogenesis, and the ovulation takes place on the 14th day of the menstrual cycle. So we're going to be talking about that in the menstrual cycle, but first you have to know this story so that you understand it. Another diagram just recapping all this. You have to understand we first called it the primary follicle. Here we call it the primary follicle, then we go into the growing follicle, then the developing follicle, and you see the fluid filled spaces appearing, and then a mature follicle, and then a ruptured follicle. And the ovum has come out, so ovulation has taken place, and then early corpus luteum, then the corpus luteum, and the corpus albicans. But of course, this is all called the corpus luteum, so let's look at it from the O-level concept. This is all corpus luteum. So the remains of it is called the corpus luteum. When the ovum has been passed out into the fallopian tube or the oviducts, the ovum goes into the oviducts with the follicle cells, then the remaining thing is called the corpus luteum. Now we need to concentrate on the uterus. Now, what is happening in the uterus during the menstrual cycle? Now, we talked about the ovary. Now we're going to talk about the uterus. Now, in the first phase, which you can see here, is menstruation. So, day 1 to day 5, the uterus lining is shed. Day 1 to day 5, the uterus lining is shed with a little bit of blood. So, this is the time which is called the menstruation time. Then comes the second is the follicular phase. Now this lasts from here to here. This is what is happening inside the ovary. The follicle is developing. At day 14, then ovulation is going to take place. So we say 3 ovulation. Now ovulation has taken place. Now within this time, there's a certain time period because the ovum lives for a certain time and the sperms can live for 3 days and the ovum lives for 48 hours. So within this time, either fertilization is going to take place or it's not going to take place. So if no sperms are present, then no fertilization. But if sperms are present, they have to be living. And sperms only live for 3 days. So during this time, ovulation has to be taking place because if day 14, that's the only time when ovulation has taken place and the fertilization can take place. After this, the ovum dies. Before this, the ovum has not been released. So during this time, no pregnancy can take place if sexual intercourse occurs. Then, of course, we have the luteal phase. Luteal phase is the time when the corpus luteum forms and progesterone is released from the ovaries, and this develops the thickening of the lining of the uterus. The lining of the uterus becomes more spongy and vascular. Why does it become more spongy and vascular? So that if fertilization has taken place, then it is going to implant. The ball of cells is going to implant into the lining. For that, it has to be spongy and vascular because it will take a few days for the placenta to develop. And during this time, it must get its nutrients from the spongy, vascular lining of the uterus. So you have to understand this, which I'm saying menstruation, lining is shed, then lining repairs, and also the follicle is being formed in the ovary. So the lining repairs and the follicle is formed, the Graafian follicle is formed in the ovary. In then ovulation takes place, corpus luteum is formed, and the corpus luteum results in the thickening of the lining. Now, if no pregnancy takes place, now of course the levels of hormones start to decrease, and then again we start the new cycle. So again, the menstrual cycle starts. That's why we say it's a monthly cycle. Now, this is a very good diagram which is showing you all these on one page. So this is the lining of the uterus, which is showing how during menstruation the lining is shed, then it's repaired, and then it becomes spongy and vascular, and then of course it again the new cycle is going to start. So this is showing you the thickness of the uterus lining. Then we have two hormones. Now the pituitary hormones are FSH and LH. So which one is FSH? As you can see here, I'm going to give it different colors. So LH is the darker purple one, which is this one, which just increases before ovulation and then dies down. We call this the LH surge. So LH increases on day 13. So it increases on day 13 and then suddenly decreases. So day 13, 14, 15. So this is called the LH surge. While the FSH, I'm going to give it another color. The FSH is increasing, then sort of becomes a little more, and then it sort of dies down. But it's FSH is still there and it's present. Then estrogen and progesterone. Now you can see how this is very different, the estrogen and progesterone. Now the estrogen values Estrogen increases just before the day 14 and then it remains and then goes a little up and then it remains down. While the progesterone starts to increase near about day 14, it increases and then it remains high and then decreases. So progesterone is this one, estrogen is this one. So you can see estrogen increases because it results in the repair of the lining of the uterus and it also promotes the development of the Graafian follicle. The progesterone starts to increase when the corpus luteum has been formed. That is when ovulation has taken place. So that's why it starts to increase after that. I want you to see a number of diagrams so that whenever you get such a question, you're not confused by it. So this is a diagram of the uterus wall. So you can see here the lining is shed and then it's increasing and then it becomes more spongy and vascular. Now you can see what is needed for this lining to repair. You need FSH and you need estrogen. Why FSH is called follicle stimulating hormone? FSH is called follicle stimulating hormone and is produced by the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland produces it, is carried in the blood and it reaches and works on the ovarian cells. So because it must be having a target organ. So target organ is the ovary where the follicle starts to develop. Estrogen is produced by the ovary and it causes the repair of the lining of the uterus. So that works. The target organ is the lining of the uterus. So estrogen and FSH also are needed for the development of the follicle. They're also needed, the estrogen is needed for the repair of the lining of the uterus. And then you can see here on day 14, ovulation has taken place. So you can see how the estrogen level has started to rise. It remains high, but then no fertilization. So then it's going to again decrease the levels. So estrogen levels you can say are increasing here and then it decreases and then it remains low. A slight change in it. Then FSH is this here increasing, then a slight and then it remains. LHS is of course the one which is the most, it is very short lived. It just comes here, peaks on the day 14 and then it dies down. Now, this is a very simplified version of it. And there are of course slightly more complicated versions of it. But basically you've got to understand the one which peaks on day 14 has to be LH. The one which peaks around about day 7 is FSH. And then the estrogen peaks around day 9, day 10. And estrogen, of course, starts to rise at day 14 because that's when the corpus luteum is formed. So I hope now the menstrual cycle is clear to you all and it's a little better. But when you do the MCQs and the papers on it, that's when actually you're put to test is whether you've understood it or not. Just by reading and watching these videos is not going to be helpful unless you go and do the questions on these. Now coming to the last topic, the placenta can prevent some toxins, harmful substances in the mother's blood from reaching the embryo. It cannot prevent all of them. However, alcohol and nicotine can pass to the developing fetus. If the mother is a drug addict, the baby can be born addicted to the drug. Very sad. Some viruses like the rubella virus, German measles virus, and HIV can pass across the placenta. Rubella, German measles, although a mild infection for the mother, can infect the fetus and result in major health problems. These include deafness, congenital heart disease, diabetes, and mental retardation. HIV is potentially fatal. So we have to know because this has been added new to the syllabus, so we have to know this. Now, please understand that viruses, there are very few viruses, but some can cross the placenta, and this, of course, has very bad effects on the fetus. And when the fetus is born, that baby will have some defects in it. Now, that ends this video. Thank you very much. And this is the 5th video on this chapter. So that finishes this chapter. Thank you very much.